They had no idea who they were dealing with. When Malik Carter and his family boarded their first-class flight, they expected a smooth journey, but what happened next would shock the entire airline industry. A biased flight attendant, a wrongful removal, and a fight for justice that went viral worldwide. What would you do if you were humiliated in front of your family, treated like you didn't belong? Stay until the very end, because this story is far from over, and trust me, you won't believe how it ends. Story from the scene from an exit interview. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story like this. New York JFK International Airport, boarding gate A-17. The hushed luxury of the VIP boarding lounge shimmered with soft golden lighting as passengers sipped champagne and exchanged polite conversations. High-ranking executives, celebrities, and elite travelers lounged comfortably, their designer luggage neatly placed at their feet. The flight to Paris was fully booked in first class, and every passenger in the exclusive boarding area exuded a sense of belonging. Except for the Carters. Malik Carter, a tall, well-dressed man with a quiet confidence, sat beside his wife Elena, whose sharp eyes scanned the room, already sensing the unspoken tension. Their 7-year-old son, Noah, bounced excitedly in his seat, gripping his small toy airplane as he made quiet engine noises. He had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, a family getaway before Malik attended a major investment summit in Europe. Elena shifted slightly, her intuition buzzing. It wasn't paranoia. She could feel the subtle stares, the polite yet wary glances from certain passengers and staff. They had experienced this before. "Malik," she murmured under her breath, "do you notice?" Malik didn't look up from his phone. "Yeah," he said smoothly, without reacting. He had learned not to give these moments power. Just then, the soft chime of the boarding announcement echoed through the lounge. "First-class passengers, welcome aboard Flight 297 to Paris. You may now proceed to the jet bridge." Noah leapt to his feet. "We're going to fly, Daddy." Malik chuckled, ruffling his son's curls. "Yes, we are, little man." Elena exhaled, shaking off her unease. Malik was right. This was their moment to relax, a much-needed escape from their demanding schedules. The first-class cabin was a masterpiece of modern aviation luxury. Private suites, champagne service, and state-of-the-art technology. Plush leather recliners gleamed under the soft ambient lights, and passengers were already settling in, flipping through menus of gourmet selections. As the Carters entered, a distinct shift in the atmosphere rippled through the space. Some passengers offered polite nods, while others did a quick double-take, as if processing whether they belonged. Malik, accustomed to these unspoken challenges, guided Elena and Noah to their seats, his movements slow and deliberate. Malik adjusted his blazer, his executive presence undeniable. He placed his sleek leather briefcase in the overhead bin and helped Noah settle into his seat. Elena, always composed, unfastened her silk scarf and folded it neatly into her lap, her eyes flickering around the cabin. That's when she saw her. Claudia Reynolds. The head flight attendant, a tall woman with striking blonde hair tied in a perfect chignon, stood near the galley entrance. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture rigid, and her eyes locked onto the Carters with a gaze that was too focused to be casual. Elena felt it instantly. The judgment. Claudia's smile was practiced, but her eyes betrayed her thoughts. She strode towards them with purpose, her crisp heels clicking against the carpeted floor. "Good evening," Claudia greeted, her tone even but carrying an unmistakable edge. "May I see your boarding passes, please?" Malik looked up, calm but mildly surprised. "Of course." He retrieved the passes from his jacket pocket and handed them over smoothly. Claudia accepted them but did not immediately glance at them. Instead, her eyes lingered on the Carters for a fraction too long, as if assessing them. Elena's stomach tightened. The moment stretched. Finally, Claudia lowered her gaze and examined the passes with unnecessary scrutiny. She tilted them slightly, as though checking for hidden errors. Malik's patience remained intact, but Elena saw the telltale tightening of his jaw. After a beat too long, Claudia handed them back. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." She turned to Elena. Mrs. Carter?" A pause. Then, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, Claudia added casually, "I wasn't expecting this reservation." Elena's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. "I'm sorry?" Malik's voice was smooth, unreadable. Claudia's smile remained fixed. "It's just that these are premium suites. Most of our first-class passengers are frequent VIP travelers. Sometimes people mistakenly book these thinking they're in business class." A chilling silence. The implication was so thinly veiled it was practically transparent. Malik's eyes remained locked onto Claudia's, his expression betraying nothing. He had encountered this before: the coded language, the polite condescension, the invisible line people like Claudia believed they had the right to enforce. Elena's voice was silken steel. "We didn't mistakenly book anything. This is our cabin." Claudia's eyes flicked between them, as if considering whether to push further. Noah, blissfully unaware, was playing with his toy plane, humming to himself. Claudia hesitated, then forced a smile. "Of course. Please make yourselves comfortable." She turned sharply on her heel and strode back toward the galley, her movements stiff. Elena's hands curled into fists in her lap. "That wasn't normal," she said softly. "No," Malik agreed, leaning back in his seat. "It wasn't." The whisper of prejudice. From the galley, Claudia's expression had darkened. She placed her hands on the counter, taking a slow, steady breath. She had worked for this airline for 12 years. She knew every face, every regular flyer in first class. The Carters? They didn't match. She reached for the intercom. "Lisa, can you pull up a verification check on passengers in first row A?" A brief pause, then the radio crackled. "Is there an issue?" Claudia hesitated. She knew how it would sound if she said it outright. So instead, she lowered her voice. "Just a routine check. I want to confirm their credentials." Lisa sounded puzzled but complied. "Give me a second." Claudia exhaled, forcing calm. It wasn't personal. It was about standards. And something about them didn't feel right. Malik adjusted his seat, exhaling slowly. The subtle hum of the aircraft's engines vibrated beneath his feet. Across from him, Elena's sharp eyes tracked Claudia Reynolds as she disappeared behind the curtain leading to the galley. "She's not done," Elena murmured. Malik didn't look up. "I know." Their son Noah sat between them, swinging his little legs, absorbed in his toy plane. His innocence in the moment was both a comfort and a gut-wrenching reminder of why they had to handle this carefully. Elena crossed her arms. "I hate this feeling. Like we have to prove something. Like we have to be twice as polite, twice as composed, just to avoid being labeled as the problem." Malik finished for her. She let out a frustrated sigh. "I hate it." He reached over, squeezing her hand. "I know, but we don't flinch." In the galley, Claudia Reynolds was fuming. She hadn't expected the Carters to push back so calmly. Their confidence unsettled her. She tapped her manicured nails against the service counter, thinking. She needed justification, a real reason to remove them, something that wouldn't make her look like the villain. Then, an idea. She grabbed the intercom and called ground control. "Lisa, this is Claudia," she said, lowering her voice. "I have an administrative discrepancy with 2 passengers in first class. Their names are Malik and Elena Carter. Can you double-check their booking?" Lisa hesitated. I already confirmed them, Claudia." Claudia pressed forward. "I know, but something isn't adding up. They don't match the usual first-class travelers. I just need to make sure there isn't a mistake." Lisa sighed. "Fine, give me a second." Claudia set the receiver down and smoothed her uniform, stealing a glance toward the curtain. She could still see the tops of their heads from where she stood. Then the intercom crackled again. Claudia, I double-checked. Their reservation is perfectly valid. Claudia's stomach tightened. This wasn't over. Her gaze flicked to the two uniformed airline security officers standing near the cockpit door. Her next move, she would make this official. The murmur of quiet conversation filled the first-class cabin as passengers adjusted their seats and browsed the gourmet menus. The soft clinking of champagne glasses created an atmosphere of exclusivity. Then Claudia re-emerged, her expression carefully neutral, flanked by two uniformed airline security officers. Elena stiffened. Here we go. Malik leaned back, his expression unreadable. He had been in boardrooms where men tried to undermine him with the same forced authority Claudia was about to use. Claudia stopped at their row, cleared her throat, and raised her voice, just loud enough for the other passengers to hear. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, I'm afraid we have an administrative error regarding your booking. Malik tilted his head. An error? Claudia nodded, keeping her voice calm, controlled, and yet dripping with condescension. Yes, unfortunately there was a mix-up with your reservation. It appears your seats were incorrectly assigned to first class. The cabin fell silent. Passengers shifted, eyes flicking toward the scene. Some whispered, their curiosity piqued. Elena's blood boiled, but she kept her expression neutral. Incorrectly assigned, she repeated, voice like silk. Yes, Claudia continued. We need to relocate you to business class while we sort this out. Noah, still clutching his toy plane, looked up at his mother with wide eyes. Malik's jaw tightened. His voice, though calm, carried an unmistakable weight of authority. Our seats were booked weeks in advance, paid in full, and confirmed before takeoff. What exactly is the issue? Claudia didn't blink. She gestured toward the security officers. Sir, I'm asking you to please cooperate. The phrase cooperate made Elena flinch, a familiar coded word, a warning wrapped in politeness. The moment that turned the cabin against them, Malik did not move. His voice remained low and steady. What happens if I don't cooperate? One of the security officers shifted uncomfortably. The other stiffened, clearly expecting escalation. Claudia sighed dramatically, then turned toward the entire first-class cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. We are experiencing a seating issue with these passengers, but we will have it resolved shortly. A few passengers frowned, clearly uncomfortable. Others murmured among themselves. A middle-aged man in a gray suit leaned toward his companion. Did they sneak in here? He muttered. A well-dressed woman across the aisle shook her head. They're saying there was a mix-up, another man sighed. Why don't they just move and stop making a scene? The humiliation rolled over Elena in waves. She had fought so hard to shield Noah from moments like these, and now his small fingers were clutching at her sleeve, sensing the tension, looking to her for reassurance. Malik, however, was unmoved. We're not going anywhere, he stated firmly. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. A voice cut through the silence. This doesn't seem right, an older woman with silver hair said softly. They had their tickets verified. Why are they being singled out? Another passenger, a younger black man in a tailored suit, frowned. This isn't a mix-up, he murmured. Yet there were others who weren't convinced. A blonde woman in pearls whispered to her husband, maybe they really did book the wrong seats. The doubt, the whispers, the lingering stares, it was all too familiar. Elena's hands were trembling, but she forced herself to stay composed. Noah looked up at his father. Are we in trouble, Daddy? Elena felt her heart crack. Malik turned to his son, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. No, buddy, we're exactly where we're supposed to be. Claudia exhaled sharply, losing some of her patience. Sir, this is your last chance. Please follow me to business class. Malik turned his full attention to her. His next words came slow and deliberate. If you are forcing us to move, I would like a formal, written explanation right now, on airline letterhead, with your signature, stating exactly why. The demand startled Claudia. Passengers watched her expectantly. She hesitated. And in that hesitation, the power shifted. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't expected Malik Carter to be this prepared. The security officers exchanged uncertain glances. Claudia forced a tight smile. I don't have the authority to issue that. Then, Malik said, adjusting his blazer. We're not moving. The air felt electric. Passengers who had once been skeptical were now watching Claudia instead of the Carters. Claudia felt it. The murmur shifting in tone, the slow but steady erosion of her control. She clenched her jaw. She needed to act. Now. She turned sharply, whispering something to the security officers before storming back to the galley. Elena took a slow breath, her heartbeat pounding. She's about to escalate this, she whispered. Malik's voice was low, steady, and certain. Let her. Malik took a steady breath, his fingers wrapped tightly around the armrest. The first-class cabin was eerily silent, save for the quiet murmur of passengers whispering among themselves. Claudia had disappeared behind the galley curtain, but he knew she wasn't done. Elena leaned in, her voice low. She's going to escalate this. Malik nodded, his jaw tight. I know. He reached into his pocket, retrieving his phone. If Claudia wanted to play this game, he would fight with facts. He opened the airline's VIP concierge line, a number reserved for elite members, people like him, major investors, and high-value customers. He hit dial. The line rang twice before a smooth, professional voice answered. Good evening, Mr. Carter. How may I assist you? Malik barely had time to reply. From the corner of his eye, Claudia re-emerged, but this time her expression had changed. No longer feigning politeness. Her lips were set in a hard line, her posture stiff. Behind her, the two airline security officers stood closer now, their hands resting on their belts. She moved swiftly, her sharp voice slicing through the cabin air. Mr. Carter, she announced, loud enough for every passenger to hear, we have given you multiple chances to comply. Your behavior is now escalating into a security concern. Elena stiffened. Excuse me? Malik lowered his phone slowly, his pulse spiking. Claudia turned to the security officers and nodded slightly. One of them, a tall, burly man with a buzz cut, stepped forward. Sir, we're going to have to ask you to step away from your seat and come with us, the officer said, his voice carefully neutral but firm. Noah, still clutching his toy airplane, froze. Daddy? Malik's body tensed. Come with you where? Claudia folded her arms. We are treating this as a potential security risk. You were on the phone in the middle of a dispute, and given the heightened safety concerns these days, we cannot allow disruptions in first class. Malik's blood ran cold. She was spinning the narrative, twisting his calm resistance into a threat. Elena's breath came fast and sharp. This is absurd. He wasn't causing a disruption. He was... Claudia held up a hand as if scolding a child. Mrs. Carter, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Passengers were now openly watching, whispering, their eyes darting between Malik, the security officers, and Claudia. A man in a business suit muttered, They're probably overreacting. Another, a middle-aged woman, whispered, But if he's refusing to cooperate, maybe there's a reason. Malik clenched his fists, willing himself to stay composed. He could feel the weight of expectation, the need to not give them a single excuse. He stood slowly, adjusting his suit jacket. I'd like to speak with the captain, he said, his voice controlled. Claudia's smirk was almost imperceptible. That won't be necessary. She nodded again, and the two officers moved in unison. Before Malik could react, they grabbed his arms. Elena shot up from her seat. Wait! What are you doing? Malik instinctively tensed, the primal part of his brain roaring to fight back. But he knew better. They wanted him to resist. Noah started crying, his small hands reaching for his father. Daddy! Elena pushed toward them, but one of the officers stepped between her and Malik. Ma'am, stay in your seat. Malik forced himself not to resist, his muscles coiled in restraint. If he fought back, if he so much as flinched the wrong way, they would escalate this into something even worse. Instead, he locked eyes with Elena. Stay with Noah, he said quietly. Noah was sobbing now, confused and terrified. Daddy, don't go. Daddy, please. Passengers were now openly staring, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others looking away. The walk of humiliation began. The officers dragged Malik through the first-class cabin, down the narrow aisle, past passengers who either gawked or refused to meet his eyes. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. Where are you taking him? Claudia turned, brushing her hands together as if dusting off the problem. He will be detained in the holding area near the galley until further notice. Elena's vision blurred with rage. Elisa! Elena, for what? Claudia's satisfied expression made her stomach turn. For failing to comply with flight crew orders. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Elena and Noah alone in first class, humiliated, abandoned, and furious. The officers led Malik through the galley, past the curtains shielding first class from the rest of the plane. The space they shoved him into was cramped and dimly lit, barely large enough to stand. One of the officers crossed his arms. We'll let the captain decide what happens next. Malik took a slow breath, forcing his rage into cold calculation. This wasn't about an administrative mix-up anymore. This was about power, humiliation, and the narrative they were crafting against him. He needed to control his next move carefully. He reached for his phone, but one of the officers snatched it away. No electronics, sir, he said, his tone clipped. Malik stared at him, unblinking. Then get me the captain. Neither officer moved. Instead, they stood at the entrance, like guards at a prison door. Malik leaned back against the cold wall. Fine. If they wouldn't let him make a call, he would wait. He would gather every piece of evidence in his mind, every detail of this ordeal, and use it to burn their excuse for a case to the ground. Back in first class, Noah was sobbing into Elena's lap, his little chest heaving as he tried to understand why his father had been taken away. Elena's fingers trembled as she texted furiously, her anger crystallizing into determination. She pulled up her contacts and hit dial. Hello? A familiar voice answered. A lawyer? Elena? The woman on the other end sounded surprised. I need your help, right now, she explained quickly, her voice tight with fury, her hands shaking as she tried to comfort Noah. When she finished, there was silence. Then, Elena, do you realize how serious this is? Her lawyer friend said. They just detained Malik mid-flight. If they report this as a security threat, they could land and have him taken into custody. Elena's stomach dropped. No. 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 This wasn't happening. Not to Malik. Not like this. Her breath shuddered, but then her back straightened, her resolve solidifying. We have to stop this before it goes that far, she said. She gritted her teeth, her pulse pounding with determination. They had underestimated who they were dealing with. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Samantha Green had always prided herself on staying neutral. As a junior flight attendant, she had been trained to follow orders, avoid confrontation, and above all, never challenge a senior crew member. But as she stood frozen in the dimly lit galley, gripping a cup of untouched coffee, she knew that today was different. From where she stood, she could hear Noah Carter's cries. the muffled sobs of a child too young to understand why his father had been forcibly removed from his seat. Her stomach twisted. She had been watching from the sidelines, unwilling to involve herself, but when Malik had been dragged down the aisle, her heart had lurched. She knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't a security risk. This was a lie. A well-crafted, insidious lie built on the power of perception, and she had been complicit just by standing there. Samantha glanced over her shoulder. In the galley, Claudia Reynolds stood with her arms folded, watching the first-class cabin like a hawk. She had won this round and she knew it. Samantha could see it in the way her lips curled at the edges, the way her posture was too relaxed, like someone who had just solidified their control. Samantha's grip tightened around her phone. Her conscience screamed at her. You should say something. You should tell the truth. But she knew what happened to people who challenged authority in this industry. They didn't last. Claudia was well respected, admired by upper management. If Samantha went against her, she wouldn't just lose a friend. She could lose her entire career. A slow, cold dread crept through her veins. She didn't know what to do. Her fingers hovered over her phone screen. Then, almost without thinking, she hit record. The camera lens framed the closed curtains separating the galley from first class. From here, the angle wasn't great, but it didn't matter. The audio would be enough. She let the recording run as she listened. Passengers were still whispering, their voices a mix of confusion, discomfort, and skepticism. Then Elena Carter's voice cut through the air, sharp and furious. "Where is my husband? I demand to speak to the captain." Claudia's icy tone followed. "Mrs. Carter, your husband was removed for causing a disruption. There is nothing more to discuss." Samantha bit her lip. That was a lie. Malik Carter had never raised his voice. He had never threatened anyone. He had simply stood his ground. And now, he was gone. Her heartbeat pounded as she listened to the murmurs of passengers. Some of them were starting to doubt Claudia's version of events. Then she heard it. Noah's wail. "Mommy, where's Daddy? Why won't they let him come back?" A gut-wrenching sound filled with fear, confusion, and desperation. Samantha felt something crack inside her. She turned, peeking through the small gap between the curtain and the cabin. She saw Elena Carter clutching Noah against her chest, whispering soft reassurances into his ear. But her face was pale with barely contained rage. Passengers stared, their expressions ranging from pity to discomfort. No one spoke up. Samantha felt a wave of nausea. This is wrong. This is so wrong. She turned away from the curtain, gripping her phone. This wasn't just another difficult situation. This was a moment in history. A moment where she could choose to be silent, or she could choose to do what was right. She swallowed hard, then hit stop on the recording. The file saved instantly. Undeniable proof. Her hands shook as she opened her messaging app and typed a number. It wasn't just any number. It wasn't just a moment of... It was her cousin's number. Her cousin, who worked for an investigative journalist in New York. She hesitated for only a second before typing. "You need to see this. This is happening right now on my flight. Look at how they're treating him." Then she attached the recording and pressed send. The moment the message went through, a cold wave of panic washed over her. What if she had just ruined her career? What if she was fired before they even landed? Her fingers hovered over the screen, her brain screaming at her to delete the message, to pretend this never happened. But then, she thought of Noah, his tears, his tiny voice asking where his daddy was. And she knew. She had done the right thing. She shoved the phone back into her pocket, her pulse hammering. Now, all she could do was wait. Back in the first-class cabin, Elena had had enough. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. Passengers turned to watch as she marched toward the flight attendant station. Claudia barely had time to react before Elena was in front of her, eyes blazing. "I need to speak to the captain," she said, her voice steady but dangerous. Claudia blinked. "Mrs. Carter, I need to speak to the captain." Claudia's mouth twitched, but before she could dismiss her again, a voice interrupted them. "I think that's a reasonable request." Elena turned. It was the older woman from first class, the one who had been watching since the beginning. She stood slowly, her silver hair shimmering under the cabin lights. "I don't like how this is being handled," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I've flown first class on this airline for over 10 years, and I have never seen someone removed like that over a seating dispute." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Another voice spoke. This time, it was the younger black man in a tailored suit. "She's right. This doesn't feel right." Elena's breath hitched. It was happening. The tide was turning. Passengers were starting to question the narrative. Claudia's mask of control slipped for the first time. In the galley, Samantha clutched the counter, trying to calm her racing heart. Her phone buzzed. She yanked it out of her pocket. It was her cousin. "Holy shit, this is insane. Who is the guy?" Samantha glanced toward Claudia. She was losing control of the situation, and fast. Now was the time. Samantha took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Claudia," she said, her voice carefully measured. "Maybe we should just let Mrs. Carter speak to the captain." Claudia whirled. "Excuse me?" Samantha lifted her chin. "She has a right to know what's happening with her husband. And honestly, I think the passengers are starting to feel the same way." Claudia's face darkened. "Are you questioning my authority?" Samantha's stomach churned, but she held her ground. "I just think we should avoid making this worse than it already is." Claudia opened her mouth, ready to tear into her, but before she could, a new voice interrupted. The pilot. "Ladies, what exactly is going on here?" The tension in the cabin shifted. For the first time, Claudia looked uncertain. And in that moment, Samantha knew she had made the right choice. The battle wasn't over yet, but the first crack in Claudia's control had just appeared, and Samantha was going to make sure it spread. At this moment in our story, Malik Carter has been unjustly removed from first class, humiliated in front of his wife and son, and detained for simply standing his ground. His only crime? Existing in a space where some people believed he didn't belong. Think about that. Malik wasn't disruptive, he wasn't violent, he was calm, composed, and dignified in the face of blatant discrimination. And yet, that wasn't enough to protect him. This is more than just a story. This is a reality that too many people of color face daily. Now, the question is, what should Malik do next? Should he fight back legally, taking this to court to demand justice? Should he go to the media, exposing the airline for their discriminatory practices? Should he make sure no one else experiences this again by demanding systemic change? Comment below. What would you do if this happened to you or someone you loved? What steps should Malik take next to ensure accountability? Your voice matters. Just like Malik is standing up for himself, we need to stand up for what's right. Drop a comment, share your thoughts, and let's make sure no one else has to fight this battle alone. Stay tuned for part 5, because this fight is far from over. London Heathrow Airport, 3:47 a.m. local time. The heavy thud of the landing gear jolted Malik from his thoughts. The aircraft rumbled as it descended, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. His wrists were stiff from being held in that cramped, dimly lit holding area, his pride bruised, but his mind sharp. He knew what was coming. As soon as the plane taxied to a stop, The two airline security officers who had been stationed at the door straightened their backs, exchanged a glance. "Mr. Carter," the taller one said, voice carefully neutral but laced with authority, "we're going to need you to step off the plane with us." Malik's jaw clenched. He forced himself to stay composed. "And if I refuse?" His voice was calm but cutting. The officer didn't blink. "Then we'll have to involve airport security. I'd rather not escalate things further." As if he had been the one escalating the situation all along. Malik exhaled slowly, his muscles tight with frustration. He wasn't about to give them a reason to drag him off like some criminal. He grimaced. His only move now? Play this smart. He adjusted his blazer, straightened his posture, and nodded once. "I'll cooperate," he said. "For now." The officers moved aside, allowing him to step forward. As they guided him toward the front exit of the aircraft, Malik didn't miss the way the first-class passengers turned to watch. Some had the decency to look ashamed. Others simply looked away, unwilling to acknowledge what was happening. And then he saw her. Noah, his son's tear-streaked face peeking over the armrest of his first-class seat. "Daddy?" Malik's heart cracked. Elena was already unbuckling her seatbelt, her sharp eyes blazing as she shot to her feet. "Where are you taking my husband?" Claudia, still standing near the flight attendant station, stepped forward, arms crossed over her chest, her expression smug and satisfied. "The decision has been made," she said smoothly. "Due to the security concern Mr. Carter has caused on this flight, he will not be allowed to reboard when we take off for Paris." A thick silence filled the cabin. Then, "The hell he won't!" Elena's voice cut through the air like a blade. The passengers gasped. Claudia's expression twitched, but she quickly masked it with feigned authority. "I suggest you keep your voice down, Mrs. Carter," she said, her tone condescending. Elena took a step forward, and in that moment, Malik had never seen his wife look more dangerous. "No," she said, voice shaking with fury. "I suggest you listen to me very carefully. Because what you've done, what you're still doing, isn't just wrong, it's illegal. And I guarantee you, you're not going to get away with it." Elena was already pulling out her phone, her fingers moving furiously over the screen. Claudia let out a mocking laugh. "Mrs. Carter, you can call whomever you like. This decision has already been made." Elena's eyes snapped up. "Oh, I know that," she said, her voice dangerously smooth. "But you clearly have no idea who you just tried to erase." The first number she dialed was her lawyer friend in New York. The second, a senior executive in the aviation industry. Someone she had known for years. A powerful woman with enough influence to ruin people like Claudia with a single phone call. And the third, a journalist. Because if this flight crew thought they could bury what they had done to Malik Carter, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. As soon as the first call connected, Elena didn't waste a second. "Carla, I need you to listen carefully," she said. "My husband has just been removed from an international flight, and they are trying to ban him from reboarding without cause. I need this on record." Carla, the lawyer, was silent for 2 beats. Then, "Elena, are you telling me Malik is being detained?" "Yes," Elena said through clenched teeth. "Jesus Christ," Carla muttered. "I'm calling Heathrow Airport authorities right now. Don't let them take him anywhere." Elena ended the call and immediately dialed the next number. Passengers were now openly staring, murmuring among themselves. A well-dressed man a few rows away leaned toward his wife and muttered, "I think she means business." "No!" She meant war. From the galley, Samantha Green was watching everything unfold, her heart pounding. She had done the right thing when she sent the recording to her cousin. But now, as she saw Malik being escorted off the plane, saw Elena fighting back with everything she had, she realized it wasn't enough. She had to do more. She had to make sure the right people saw the recording before it was too late. With shaking fingers, she pulled up her messaging app and sent the file to a new number. Malik's legal team, she typed fast. You don't know me, but I'm a flight attendant on flight 297. I have proof that Malik Carter was removed without cause. I recorded the entire conversation. Please use this before it's too late. She hit send. And then she prayed. Malik faces Heathrow security. The cold night air hit Malik like a slap as he stepped off the plane and into the Heathrow terminal. 2 uniformed airport security officers were waiting. The moment they saw him, Malik could tell they already had their orders. Mr. Carter, one of them said, voice clipped. I'm afraid we need to ask you a few questions before you're allowed to proceed. Malik's jaw tightened. He had been through a lot in his life. Boardroom battles, corporate betrayals, racist microaggressions disguised as company policy. But this was something else entirely. He was moments away from being officially detained. And once that happened, reputations could be destroyed in minutes. Then his phone buzzed. A message from his legal team. Malik, a flight attendant just sent us a recording. We have proof. We're already moving. Hang tight. His pulse spiked. Proof. This wasn't just his word against theirs anymore. They had evidence. The game had just changed. Malik took a slow, measured breath and turned to the security officers. Before you ask me anything, he said smoothly, I suggest you take a look at the file my legal team just sent to the airline's corporate office. And for the first time that night, he saw doubt. It flickered in the officer's carefully neutral expression, in the way he hesitated before responding. Because someone, somewhere, had just realized they had made a very, very big mistake. Malik didn't smile. Not yet. But he would. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. London Heathrow Airport, holding area. Malik sat in a stiff metal chair, his back straight, his heart pounding a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. He had been here before. Not literally, but in rooms where power was unevenly distributed, where the rules bent based on skin color, and where perception was often more dangerous than reality. He was surrounded by silence. The 2 airport security officers stood at the other side of the room, one flipping through a folder of documents, the other watching Malik with measured curiosity. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his legal team. They know who you are now. The airline's corporate office is in full panic mode. Malik exhaled slowly. It had begun. At that very moment, inside the airline's headquarters, a crisis meeting was unfolding. Robert Sterling, the CEO, stood at the head of a long conference table, his face drained of color as executives scrambled to damage control mode. Someone tell me this isn't real, Sterling muttered, gripping the edge of the table as the footage played on a large screen. The recording from Samantha Green, the whistleblower flight attendant, was now in their hands. It was damning. In the footage, Claudia Reynolds' condescending tone was clear. The way she singled Malik out. The way she called security the moment he asked to speak to the captain. But the worst part? Noah's wails. His tearful cries for his father had been captured in painful clarity, and already it was sparking outrage online. Sterling ran a shaky hand down his face. We kicked off one of our top investors. Do you all realize what we've just done? The room was silent. Then, the head of legal cleared his throat. Mr. Carter is an executive partner in this airline. Not just a wealthy passenger. He owns a stake in our company. Sterling's stomach twisted. Not only had they humiliated a major investor, but they had done it publicly, on an international flight, in an era where racial bias could destroy an entire brand overnight. And now, the world was watching. Elena's calls to journalists had worked faster than anyone had expected. By the time Malik was escorted off the plane, the first few news stories had already surfaced online. Then came the viral hashtags: flying while black, first-class racism, justice for Malik Carter. They spread like wildfire, amplified by passengers who had witnessed the injustice firsthand. Within hours, the footage made its way to major media outlets. Breaking: airline under fire for removing black investor from first class over false security claims. Live now: experts discuss systemic discrimination in aviation after Malik Carter incident. The headlines were everywhere. The airline's stock took an immediate hit, dropping 4% in pre-market trading as investors grew nervous. And back at Heathrow Airport, the security officers who had detained Malik were suddenly looking at him differently. Less like a security risk, more like a man they had just wrongfully detained based on a lie. Inside the first-class cabin, the air felt different now. Passengers were still watching Elena, who hadn't sat down since Malik was escorted off. Her body was rigid with fury, her fingers still gripping her phone as she monitored the firestorm online. Then a voice cut through the cabin. "I'd like to speak to the captain." Elena turned sharply. It was the older woman with silver hair, the one who had been watching since the beginning. "I don't feel comfortable with what I just witnessed," she said, raising her voice for others to hear. "That man was treated unfairly and I want to know why." Another voice followed. The younger black man in the tailored suit, the one who had watched everything in silence, finally spoke up. "I was sitting right here. Mr. Carter never raised his voice, never acted aggressively. I don't understand why he was removed." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. Claudia Reynolds palmed her hands together, pressing them to her lips, her nerves finally visible. She was losing control, and she knew it. Back at Heathrow, Malik remained calm as a new, higher-ranking security officer entered the holding area. This one looked uneasy. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice carefully measured. "We've received an update from the airline's corporate office." Malik raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" The officer hesitated, then exhaled heavily. "They have requested that you be allowed to reboard your flight to Paris. Immediately." Malik stared at him. "Just like that? No apology? No explanation for why he was treated like a criminal just an hour ago?" His jaw tightened. "I'll reboard," he said slowly, "but not until I receive a formal statement from the airline, acknowledging that this was a mistake." The officer's face twitched with discomfort. "I'm afraid I don't have that authority." Malik leaned forward, his voice low and lethal. "Then I suggest you call someone who does, because this wasn't just about getting back on a plane. This was about making sure this never happened again." Back on the plane, Claudia was unraveling. Passengers were asking questions. The internet was exploding. And then, her worst nightmare unfolded. The intercom buzzed, and the captain's stern voice filled the cabin. "Miss Reynolds, please report to the galley immediately." Claudia felt her throat tighten. The murmurs around her grew louder as she turned and disappeared behind the curtain. Samantha Green watched her go, a feeling of grim satisfaction settling in her chest. She had done the right thing. And now, the truth was out. 20 minutes later, as Malik stepped back onto the plane, first-class passengers turned to watch. Elena let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, her eyes locking onto his. Noah practically leapt from his seat, his little hands reaching for his father. Malik scooped him up, holding him tight. "I knew you'd come back," Noah whispered into his shoulder. Malik swallowed the lump in his throat. He placed Noah back into his seat, then turned to Elena. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her eyes said everything. They had won this round, but the real fight was just beginning. The tension in the first-class cabin was suffocating. Every passenger had witnessed the unfolding drama. Some had been complicit in their silence. Others had quietly supported the Carter family, but none of them could ignore what was happening now. Malik's return to the plane had shifted the atmosphere. There was no whispering now, no uncertain glances. Instead, a quiet storm brewed just beneath the surface, as if everyone knew something monumental was about to happen. And then the intercom crackled. "Ms. Reynolds, please report to the flight deck immediately." Claudia, who had been standing stiffly near the galley, flinched. Elena, still holding on to Noah, let out a slow breath. Samantha Green straightened in her seat, knowing exactly what was coming next. Passengers turned to watch, waiting. Passengers turned to watch, waiting. Inside the cockpit, Claudia found herself face to face with the senior flight officer and an airline executive patched in via video call. Robert Sterling, the CEO himself, was watching from a conference room back in the airline's headquarters. His expression was stone cold, his jaw tight with barely contained fury. The moment Claudia stepped in, he didn't waste time. "Miss Reynolds," he said, his voice clipped and unforgiving, "we have completed our internal review of your actions on this flight. Effective immediately, you are relieved of duty." Claudia's breath hitched. "Excuse me?" The captain folded his arms. "You've put this entire airline at risk. The corporate office is in full crisis mode because of your behavior." Claudia felt her stomach drop. No. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had been trying to protect the airline's image, keep order in first class, maintain a certain standard. And now they were throwing her away? "This is a mistake," she blurted out, her voice rising. "I was doing my job. The Carters were—" Robert Sterling cut her off. "Don't finish that sentence." His glare was icy and unrelenting. "I have seen the footage. I have read the statements from other passengers, and I have seen the backlash this company is facing," he exhaled sharply. "You, Miss Reynolds, have cost us millions in PR damages. And more importantly, you've demonstrated a complete failure in leadership and professionalism." Claudia felt the walls closing in. She looked at the captain, silently begging for backup, but his expression was neutral. She had lost. Finally, she found her voice, but it was weak now, trembling. "What happens next?" The captain lifted an eyebrow. "You will remain seated in economy for the rest of this flight," he said simply. "Upon landing, you will be escorted from the aircraft and relieved of all duties, permanently." Claudia stared in disbelief. Economy? Like a regular passenger? Like someone who didn't belong in first class? The irony burned. She opened her mouth to argue, but the captain had already turned away. The conversation was over. Back in the first-class cabin, Elena sat rigid in her seat, her hands clutching Noah as she stared at the curtain where Claudia had disappeared. She had won, but the victory felt hollow. This entire experience had been a reminder of how fragile their dignity was in spaces like this, how even their money, their status, their power hadn't been enough to shield them from bias. And Malik walked back in. Elena exhaled sharply, relief washing over her. Noah's head jerked up, his face lighting up as he scrambled out of his seat. "Daddy!" Malik knelt, arms open, catching his son as Noah threw himself forward, wrapping his little arms around his father's neck. "I thought you weren't coming back," Noah whispered, his voice small, uncertain. Malik squeezed him tighter. "I'll always come back," he murmured. Elena's eyes burned. She reached forward, placing a hand on Malik's shoulder. He turned toward her, their eyes locking in silent understanding. They were safe now, but the fight wasn't over. Not even close. Just as Malik settled back into his first-class seat, a flight attendant approached him cautiously. It wasn't Claudia. It was a man in a dark suit, the airline's chief of operations, who had flown out specifically to handle the crisis. "Mr. Carter," the man said, his voice careful, rehearsed. "On behalf of the airline, I would like to personally apologize for everything you and your family have endured." Malik lifted an eyebrow. The man swallowed hard, clearly aware that a simple apology wasn't enough. "The airline would like to offer you a private VIP suite for the remainder of this flight," he continued, "and we would greatly appreciate the opportunity to discuss this matter further upon landing." Malik leaned back, watching him closely. The panic in the man's posture was obvious. The airline was scrambling, desperate to patch up the damage before it got worse. Malik exchanged a glance with Elena. She nodded once, her meaning clear. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Malik turned back to the executive, his face unreadable. "I'll take the VIP suite," he said. "But I want a personal call from your CEO before this flight lands." The man hesitated. Then reluctantly he nodded. "I'll arrange it." An hour later, as Malik sat in the private VIP suite, sipping a glass of water, his phone buzzed. "Blocked number." He smirked. "They were finally ready to talk," he answered. "Mr. Carter?" Robert Sterling's voice came through, calm but filled with underlying tension. Malik didn't speak right away. He let the CEO squirm in the silence. Then, finally, Sterling exhaled. "I want to start by saying I take full responsibility for what happened today," he said. "We are conducting a full internal review, and I can assure you that Claudia Reynolds will never work in this industry again." Malik tilted his head. "That's a start," he said. "But firing one person doesn't fix the systemic issues in your airline." Sterling was silent for a beat. Then, "I know," he admitted. Malik leaned forward, pressing his advantage. "Then here's what's going to happen next," he said smoothly. "Your airline will issue a public apology, not just to me, but to every passenger who has ever been discriminated against under your company's policies." Sterling's breath hitched. "You will implement mandatory anti-bias training for all flight staff. You will set up a hotline for discrimination reports. And most importantly," Malik's voice hardened, "you will create a public transparency report on all racial discrimination complaints going forward." A heavy pause. Sterling exhaled slowly. "You drive a hard bargain, Mr. Carter," he muttered. Malik smirked. "No," he said. "I drive a fair one." Another beat of silence. Then, reluctantly, Sterling spoke. "We'll do it." Malik leaned back, satisfied. "That's what I thought." As the flight continued toward Paris, Malik gazed out the window, watching the clouds drift beneath them. Elena reached over, squeezing his hand. "Did they cave?" she murmured. He turned to her, his expression calm, steady. "They didn't cave," he said. "They realized they never had a choice. This wasn't just about their family anymore. This was about every person who had ever been told they didn't belong in first class. And now, everything had changed." Malik stepped off the aircraft, his posture impeccable, his expression unreadable. The weight of the last several hours still pressed against his chest, but he refused to show it. He had endured humiliation, injustice, and blatant discrimination, but now, the tables had turned. Elena walked beside him, her grip firm on Noah's small hand. Their son was quiet, still shaken from the ordeal, but his tiny fingers clutched his father's tightly, as if ensuring he wouldn't disappear again. Ahead of them, a team of airline executives stood stiffly, waiting. Robert Sterling, the CEO, was among them, his suit neatly pressed but his face showing clear signs of exhaustion. His company had been in damage control mode for hours, scrambling to salvage its reputation in the wake of the viral backlash. Sterling stepped forward, forcing a polite but tense smile. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter," he began, nodding toward Elena as well. "I'd like to personally apologize for the treatment you received aboard Flight 297. Elena's expression was icy. "Is that all you'd like to do?" Sterling swallowed hard. "No," he admitted. "That's not all." Malik let the silence drag out, watching as Sterling shifted uncomfortably. Then finally the CEO gestured toward a private conference room, its glass walls tinted for privacy. "We've prepared a detailed statement about the reforms we are implementing," Sterling said. "If you would, I'd like to go over them with you now." Malik nodded once. "Let's see if they're worth my time." Inside the conference room, Sterling slid a printed document across the table. "These are the steps we're implementing immediately," he said, his voice carefully measured. Malik glanced down, scanning the bolded list. Number 1. Mandatory bias training for all employees. Every airline staff member, from flight attendants to corporate executives, will undergo mandatory anti-bias and racial sensitivity training. Number 2. A dedicated passenger hotline for discrimination/reports. A new 24/7 hotline will be created, where passengers can report incidents of discrimination in real time. Number 3. Stricter accountability policies for staff misconduct. Any future allegations of racial bias or unjust passenger treatment will be investigated immediately with clear consequences for offenders. Number 4. A public apology to the Carter family. The airline will issue a formal public apology, acknowledging the wrongdoing and committing to systemic change. Number 5. Ongoing oversight and external review board. A third-party oversight board will be established to review discrimination complaints transparently. Malik folded his arms. "And what guarantees do I have that these aren't just empty promises?" Sterling hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he slid another document forward. "This is a formal contract," he said. "We want you to personally oversee the implementation of these reforms as a paid consultant." Elena blinked in surprise. Malik, however, merely lifted an eyebrow. Sterling shifted in his seat, knowing he needed to sell this idea. "Mr. Carter," he said, voice firm but genuine, "you have every right to walk away from this and never look back. But if you stay involved, you can ensure this never happens to another passenger again." Malik held his gaze for a long moment. Then, finally, he reached for the pen. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Claudia Reynolds sat in her small apartment, staring at her phone with bloodshot eyes. The news had spread everywhere. Every major network had picked up the story of Flight 297, and with it, her name. Former flight attendant Claudia Reynolds, fired after racially profiling VIP passenger. Flying while black and first-class racism were still trending. Her inbox was flooded. Some messages were viciously critical. Others were mockingly polite, sending links to the latest articles about her downfall. Then came the email she had dreaded the most. Subject: employment status, termination notice. Her breath hitched as she read the words. "Effective immediately, you are permanently banned from employment with airline name and all affiliated partners. Your name has been entered into the National Airline Misconduct Database, making you ineligible for future aviation employment." Her hands shook. She tried to tell herself it wasn't fair, that she had only been following protocol. But deep down she knew the truth. She hadn't just followed policy. She had targeted Malik Carter because she thought she could get away with it. And now, she had lost everything. Back in Paris, Samantha Green stood in front of a panel of journalists, her heart pounding. She had made her decision. She had resigned from the airline that morning, and now, standing here before the press, she knew there was no turning back. "Why did you choose to speak out?" one reporter asked. Samantha took a deep breath. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said simply. She recounted everything. How Claudia had targeted Malik, how she had twisted the truth, and how she had lied about a security risk to justify his removal. The journalists scribbled furiously, their cameras flashing. But Samantha didn't flinch. She wasn't afraid anymore. Because, for the first time, she had used her voice to make a difference. Several weeks later, Malik and his family prepared to board another flight, this time to a long overdue vacation. As they approached the first-class check-in desk, something was different. No nervous glances, no second-guessing of their tickets. Just professional courtesy, as it should have been from the start. Elena glanced at Malik as they walked down the jet bridge. "Do you think they recognize you?" she asked. Malik smirked. "It doesn't matter if they do." Noah grinned up at him. "Because now everyone belongs in first class, right, Daddy?" Malik chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "That's right, buddy," he said. As the plane took off, Malik looked out the window at the clouds below. They had changed something today, not just for themselves, but for everyone. And sometimes, that was enough. 6 months later, New York, JFK Airport, private lounge. The hum of distant conversations filled the luxurious first-class lounge, a space once familiar but now carrying a different energy for Malik Carter. As he sat with Elena and Noah, watching passengers move effortlessly around them, he couldn't help but notice the subtle but powerful changes in the airline's culture. A few months ago, stepping into a setting like this had come with unspoken challenges. The lingering stares, the second-guessing, the microaggressions disguised as protocol. Today, not a single person questioned their presence. Elena, sipping her herbal tea, leaned toward Malik. "Do you notice it?" Malik met her gaze, his lips curling into a small smirk. "I do." She glanced around, taking in the calm professionalism of the airline staff, the effortless way passengers of all races and backgrounds were being welcomed with equal courtesy and respect. "This feels different," she murmured, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Malik nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the check-in counters, where flight attendants moved with genuine warmth rather than rigid suspicion. "Because we made it different." Noah, sitting beside them, glanced up from his tablet. "Does that mean we won, Daddy?" Malik turned toward his son, studying his innocent, eager expression. "We didn't just win, buddy," Malik said, ruffling Noah's curls. "We changed the game." As the boarding announcement echoed through the lounge, Malik rose to his feet, adjusting his blazer. This time, as they walked toward Gate 22, they weren't met with side eyes or tense glances. No airline personnel double-checked their tickets. No whispers questioned their place in first class. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter." The smiling flight attendant at the entrance greeted him with the same level of warmth and professionalism as every other high-tier passenger. Elena watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction, not because they had earned respect today, but because it was finally given freely, without hesitation, without bias, without an asterisk attached. She squeezed Malik's hand lightly as they stepped onto the jet bridge. "Look at that," she whispered. Malik smirked. "No security waiting for us this time." Elena chuckled softly, shaking her head. They entered the first-class cabin, settling into their seats, surrounded by the kind of luxury that had once felt tainted by discrimination, but not today. As Malik observed the cabin, he saw something that made his chest tighten with subdued pride. A black couple 2 rows ahead were settling in, their presence unquestioned. An elderly Asian woman, traveling alone, was being assisted with the same level of care as a CEO on a business trip. A Middle Eastern family was comfortably seated, with a flight attendant playfully engaging their young daughter, handing her a set of complimentary crayons and a coloring book. This wasn't just a flight anymore. It was a statement, a reminder that small victories could lead to major shifts, not just in policy, but in culture, in mindset, in how people were treated. And for Malik, that was the most important victory of all. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, prepare for takeoff." As the plane glided smoothly down the runway, Malik reached over, taking Elena's hand. Noah, nestled between them, grinned excitedly, pointing at the window as they lifted into the sky. Elena turned to Malik. You realize what this means, right? She said softly. Malik looked at her, tilting his head slightly. This isn't just about us anymore, she continued. This is about the people who come after us. People who will never have to fight this battle because it's already been fought for them. Malik smiled. That's the goal, he said. He squeezed her hand, then turned back to the window, watching the clouds shift and stretch beneath them, the horizon endless and full of possibility. Because at that moment, he knew, change doesn't happen when we accept injustice. Change happens when we challenge it. And sometimes, that was all it took to make the world a better place. As the plane soars through the sky, a battle has already been won. But the fight for justice is far from over. Malik Carter refused to back down. He stood his ground, not just for himself, but for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong. Because of his courage, we've seen change take root. A corrupt system exposed, a racist flight attendant held accountable, an airline forced to reform. But here's the truth. This isn't just about one man on one flight. This is about all of us. This is about every person who has ever been judged by their appearance instead of their character. It's about breaking the cycle of silent injustice, so that the next time someone steps into first class, a restaurant, a boardroom, or a new opportunity, they aren't questioned, challenged, or pushed aside simply because of who they are. So, what comes next? Should Malik take his fight beyond this airline, pushing for industry-wide reforms? Should he use his influence to mentor others who have faced similar discrimination? Should he take legal action to ensure airlines across the world make lasting changes? We want to hear from you. If you were in Malik's shoes, what would you do next? What changes do you think still need to happen to fight discrimination in travel and beyond? Drop a comment below and let your voice be heard, because change happens when injustice is challenged. And today, you have the power to be part of that change. Stay engaged, stay aware, and never stop demanding justice.